Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are staring down the barrel of what might be the most notorious essay prompt in American history classes.
Oh, yeah. I know exactly the one you're talking about.
You know the one. You're sitting there, pen in hand, and the question asks, to what extent was the period from 1865 to 1896 a time of continuity or change?
It is the ultimate trap question. It looks so simple on the surface.
Yeah.
You think, well, obviously things changed. The Civil War ended.
Right.
But the moment you start writing, you realize the answer is incredibly slippery.
It is. It feels like you're trying to hold on to water. We are talking about 30 years that cover Reconstruction, the Wild West, and the Gilded Age.
It's pure chaos.
It's chaotic. You have amendments, assassinations, cowboys, and robber barons. So our mission today is to help you build a bulletproof argument for this essay.
Okay.
We've got a stack of primary sources, diaries, court cases, photographs, and we're going to figure out, was this a new America or just the old one wearing a new suit?
And that metaphor is actually perfect because the thesis we found in the sources suggests exactly that. If you look at the technology and the laws, the suit, it's radically different.
Okay.
But if you look at the body underneath, the social hierarchy, the distribution of wealth, the racial dynamics, there is, well, a staggering amount of continuity.
Okay, let's test that. We have to break this down geographically or we'll get lost. Let's start in the South. 1865.
The war's over. Lee has surrendered.
Slavery is constitutionally dead. To me, that sounds like massive, undeniable change.
It is, legally.
Yeah.
And you can't ignore that in your essay. You absolutely have to start with the Reconstruction Amendment.
It's the big three.
The 13th ends slavery. The 14th redefines citizenship to include anyone born here, which completely overturns the Dred Scott decision. And the 15th says you can't deny the vote based on race.
And for a few years there, during what they call radical Reconstruction, it looked like it was sticking.
It really did.
We have records of African Americans voting in huge numbers, serving in state legislatures, and even Hiram Revels taking a seat in the U.S. Senate. That feels like a revolution.
It was. But here is where the continuity argument comes in to crush that hope. We have to look at the economic reality.
Okay.
I want to pull up a diary entry from Henry William Ravenel. He was a wealthy botanist and plantation owner in South Carolina. In March 1865, right as the war ends, he writes about the breath of emancipation causing chaos.
I can imagine.
But then he asks himself a very specific question. Will it be a benefit to the landed proprietors?
Landed proprietors? He means the old slave masters.
Exactly. And the answer, unfortunately, turned out to be yes. Because even though the legal status of the worker changed, the ownership of the land did not.
Right. The federal government flirted with the idea of land redistribution, that whole 40 acres and a mule promise.
But they ultimately gave the land back to the white planters.
So if you're a formerly enslaved person, you have freedom, but you have no money, no land, no way to feed your family.
Precisely. So what do?
You go back to work.
You go back to the same plantation you just left, and you sign a contract. This is the birth of sharecropping.
I've always found this term a bit sterile. Sharecropping sounds like a cooperative garden. But looking at the contracts in our source pile, it looks terrifyingly restrictive.
It was a trap, a total trap. The worker farms the land, but they have to give, say, 50% of the crop to the owner, just for the privilege of using the soil.
Just for rent.
But here is the kicker. They also have to buy their seeds, their tools, and their food from the landowner's store on credit.
And I'm guessing the interest rates weren't great.
They were predatory. At the end of the harvest, the worker would go to settle up, and the landowner would just say, "Great job, but after expenses, you actually owe me money."
So you can never leave.
It created a cycle of debt that legally bound them to the land. If you tried to leave while owing money, you could be arrested for it.
So, economically, the daily life of a field hand in 1880 looked almost identical to 1850. You're working cotton for a white master with no way to leave. That is continuity.
A brutal continuity.
But what about the social side? The violence?
That's the enforcement mechanism.
Yeah?
You have the Black Codes passed immediately after the war, which were laws practically cutting and pasting old slave codes.
Like banning black people from juries or owning guns.
Exactly. And when the laws weren't enough, you had terror. We all know the KKK.
But the sources mention other groups too. The Red Shirts.
The Red Shirts in the Carolinas, the White League in Louisiana. Look, these weren't just guys in hoods hiding in the woods. They were essentially the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party in the South.
They operated openly.
Oh, completely openly. Their goal was to restore the antebellum social order by force specifically by stopping black people from voting.
And eventually the North just let them.
They did. This is the pivot point for your essay, the election of 1876.
A complete mess.
A total mess, disputed votes, accusations of fraud. So the parties made a backroom deal, the Compromise of 1877. The Republicans got the presidency for Rutherford B. Hayes,
But the Democrats got what they really wanted.
which was the removal of all remaining federal troops from the South.
So the referees left the field.
And home rule returned. By the time we get to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, establishing separate but equal, the South had successfully reconstructed the racial hierarchy of slavery, just without the word slavery.
Okay, that is a grim, heavy checkmark in the continuity column. But here's a thought. When those federal troops left the South in 1877, they didn't just retire.
No, they didn't.
They went somewhere else.
That's a brilliant connection. They didn't go home, they went west. The same cavalry units that failed to protect black citizens in Georgia were sent to the plains to police Native Americans.
So let's move to the West, because if you're looking for change, the West seems like the place. I mean, the map itself changed. We have the Transcontinental Railroad finishing in 1869.
The railroad is probably the single strongest piece of evidence for technological change. Just think about the compression of time.
Right.
Before the train, getting from New York to San Francisco took 6 months by wagon or boat. 6 months. After 1869, 10 days.
That's mind-blowing. It's like going from walking to teleporting. And it wasn't just travel, it shattered the isolation of the frontier. We see the whole Great American Desert myth being replaced by the Garden of the World myth to get people to move there.
And that was driven by the Homestead Act, right? 160 acres free if you can farm it. This brought a flood of people, and we need to talk about who those people were, because the diversity of the West is often erased in the movies.
The sources were really surprising here. It wasn't just John Wayne types. We have the Exodusters. Thousands of African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South trying to find freedom in Kansas.
And the Chinese immigrants who built the railroads, doing the most dangerous work with explosives, only to be rewarded with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882.
Which was the first time the U.S. ever banned a specific ethnic group.
The first time, yeah. And don't forget the Mexican vaqueros. The entire culture of the American cowboy, the chaps, the lassos, the ranching techniques, was lifted directly from Mexican culture.
So the demographics and the technology were totally new. That sounds like change. But you mentioned earlier that the ideology remained the same.
Yes, manifest destiny. The belief that white Americans were divinely ordained to conquer the continent. That didn't start in 1865.
Not at all.
It's been the operating system of America since the beginning. The railroad just made the conquest faster.
And more brutal. The treatment of Native Americans in this period is like, it's just hard to read the sources. We see a shift from just fighting to total warfare.
It was strategic. Look at the buffalo. We have quotes from Army generals explicitly encouraging the slaughter of the buffalo herds. They knew that the Plains Indians depended on the buffalo for food, clothing, shelter.
So you kill the buffalo.
You starve the tribes onto the reservations. It's that simple.
It was ecological warfare. And once they were on the reservations, the policy shifted again. We go from removal, just get them out of the way, to assimilation. This is the Dawes Act of 1887.
The Dawes Act is fascinating because it's framed as a reform. The idea was the tribal way of life is the problem. If we can turn Indians into individual farmers like white people,
They'll be fine.
so they broke up the tribal lands.
Into little 160-acre squares for individuals and sold the rest to white settlers.
It was a land grab disguised as philanthropy.
Exactly. And it was coupled with cultural erasure. The boarding schools, like the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania,
The motto there was kill the Indian, save the man.
which meant taking children from their parents, cutting their long hair, forcing them to wear military uniforms, and beating them if they spoke their native languages.
So was it change? Yes, the tactics changed from simple warfare to cultural engineering, but was it continuity?
Absolutely. The goal remained the dispossession of native land and the erasure of native identity. Okay, so the South has a continuity of racial hierarchy. The West has a continuity of conquest. Let's head north. The Gilded Age, this has to be the change, right?
I mean, this is it.
This is the Second Industrial Revolution. We go from a nation of farmers to a nation of factories.
The scale of change here is just undeniable. In 1865, the U.S. lagged behind Britain and France. By 1900, the U.S. is the leading industrial power in the world.
Wow.
We're producing more steel than Britain and Germany combined.
And we have the rise of the titans, Carnegie in steel, Rockefeller in oil. And I want to pause on Rockefeller for a second. The sources paint him as a villain, obviously. The octopus strangling the economy.
Sure.
But he was also obsessed with efficiency.
That's a crucial nuance for the essay. Rockefeller didn't just buy up competitors to be mean. He hated waste. He saw the oil industry as chaotic and wild. By buying everyone out what we call horizontal integration, he stabilized prices and standardized the product. He brought order.
But at the cost of competition?
And at the cost of democracy, some would argue. These corporations became larger than the government. They could buy senators like they bought coal.
Which leads us to the other side of the coin, the gilded part. Mark Twain coined that term, right?
It did. Gilded means covered in a thin layer of gold, but underneath, it's cheap material.
And the gold was the wealth of the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies.
And the cheap material underneath was the reality for the working class.
We have Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives. He went into the tenements of New York City with a camera. The photos are haunting. 12 people sleeping in a room with no windows, sewage in the streets.
Children working in factories instead of going to school.
And this is where the continuity versus change debate gets really heated in the North. The nature of work changed, from outdoors to indoors, from skilled to unskilled, but the power dynamic.
That stayed pretty much the same. It was still the few controlling the many. And when the many tried to fight back, the government responded exactly like it did in the South.
You mean with violence?
Yes. Look at the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, or the Homestead Strike in 1892. Workers walked off the job to protest wage cuts. In both cases, the government didn't act as a neutral mediator.
No.
They sent in the state militia or even federal troops to break the strike and protect the property of the owners.
Wait, so the same federal troops that were pulled out of the South in 1877?
Were used to break strikes in the North that same year. It's all connected. The government prioritized property rights and order over human rights, whether those humans were formerly enslaved people, Native Americans, or factory workers.
That is a powerful thread to pull through the whole essay. It really highlights that political inaction or selective action we saw in the sources, the laissez-faire approach.
Hands off. That was the dogma. The federal government was incredibly weak and passive during this era. Presidents were mostly figureheads. The real power was in the party machines and the corporations.
We have to mention the spoils system here because it just sounds crazy to modern ears.
It is crazy. Imagine if every time a new president was elected today, they fired every single postal worker, tax collector, and administrative clerk in the country.
And replace them with their own campaign donors and cousins.
That was the reality. It wasn't about expertise, it was about loyalty.
Until it went too far.
Exactly. When President Garfield was assassinated in 1881 by a guy who was angry he didn't get a job, the government finally passed the Pendleton Act to create a civil service based on merit. That's a rare example of genuine political change in this era.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground. We've got the South, the West, and the North. If I'm the listener and I'm staring at that blank page, how do I group all this? What's the strategy?
A good question. Don't just list events chronologically, group them by theme. I'd suggest two main buckets.
Bucket 1, change.
For change, talk about the physical and legal landscape. The scale of the economy changed small shops to massive corporations. The technology changed horses to railroads, candles to electricity.
And the laws.
And the constitutional definitions changed. Citizenship and voting rights were rewritten, even if they weren't enforced.
And bucket 2, continuity.
For continuity, talk about power and ideology. The racial hierarchy in the South adapted but didn't break. The conquest in the West continued the trajectory of Manifest Destiny, and the gap between the rich and the poor,
And the government's willingness to side with the rich.
remained a constant.
That actually brings us to a final, really interesting contradiction we found in the readings, the philosophy of wealth. We saw two very different ways rich people justified this new world.
Right. On one side, you have social Darwinism. This was the idea championed by sociologists like William Graham Sumner. He took Darwin's biological theories and applied them to people.
A pretty big leap.
A huge leap. He argued that millionaires were the fittest and the poor were unfit.
So if you help the poor, you're actually hurting the species.
That was the argument. It's a sink or swim mentality. It justifies doing nothing about poverty.
But then you have Andrew Carnegie, who was a ruthless businessman. He broke the Homestead Strike,
Absolutely. But he wrote The Gospel of Wealth.
which argued the opposite, that the rich have a duty.
Yes, but not to give handouts. Carnegie hated charity. He believed in building ladders. He wanted to build libraries, universities, concert halls, places where ambitious people could pull themselves up.
So he thought dying rich was a disgrace.
But he also thought he knew how to spend that money better than the workers did.
That tension between the survival of the fittest and systemic inequality, between the responsibility of the individual and the responsibility of the state, that feels incredibly modern.
We are still having that argument today. In many ways, we're still living in the house the Gilded Age built. We've just done some renovations.
That is the perfect mic drop for an essay. We are still living in the house the Gilded Age built. Use that. Okay. You have the evidence blocks, the Ravenel Diary, the Buffalo Slaughter, the vertical integration, the strikes. Now go connect the dots.
Good luck. You got this.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.